All right. This week, we welcome back to the show the one and only Christopher Knowles, who I actually saw semi-recently in person. It's been years since I've been able to say that. But how you doing? What's going on?
Yes. Oh, lots going on. Very busy lately. Very busy. I found out that YouTube put the kibosh on. I'm not allowed to do any more live streams for some reason.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know what that's all about. I'm going to try and rectify that situation. But this is very timely because we're coming up on the 15th anniversary of our Gods Wear Spandex and the
Oh,
15th
excellent.
anniversary of the Secret Sun. So this is good timing. This is good timing.
Do you think part of you in some kind of unconscious way sort of knew that, or even a conscious way, right? Like that your mind has been kind of drawn back to similar material?
Um, I don't know. Well, this all started when I watched the Shadow movie. I rewatched
Yeah,
the Shadow movie, which is one of my guilty pleasures, right? And I know that you were a Batman Begins fan, and I was
very
like,
much.
you should watch The Shadow because it's basically the Batman Begins is just basically just a flat out rewrite of it. And I mean, it was a movie that kind of came and went. It's Alec Baldwin who's been in the news a lot lately. And, like Batman Begins, it's just basically a gay love story between the hero and his, uh, you know, quote unquote, mentor, quote unquote, antagonist, played by John Lone, who's just absolutely terrific in it. And it's a really good movie. I don't know why it didn't get an audience. I know that Jake Kotze, who's like OG Synchromystic, was a big fan of it. We talked about that 15 years ago, interestingly enough. But and that just sort of got the ball rolling. And I was like, we should really talk about the pulps because the pulps are kind of like, obviously the predecessors to the superhero thing, which is really it's good timing because the superhero thing, 15 years after Gods Wear Spandex is really winding down. I mean, the well has run dry, and
Yeah,
it's kind of like we're at the end of the cycle. We're
yeah,
at the end
very
of the
much.
superhero cycle.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just good timing overall. But sort of go back to the pulps, which are much more interesting, a lot less childish, and certainly a lot less pedo uh, content than in the comic book, uh, especially the early comic books.
Kind of surprising for the English, but anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it starts in England, but I done some stuff on Brill, the Coming Race, the Bulwer-Lytton, Lord Lytton novel, which is kind of like the start. I did a big live stream on it, and it was talking about all these shows like Sense8, 4400, Heroes, The Gifted. I mean, even stuff like Twilight, Being Human, all these kind of stories about like superhumans that aren't necessarily superheroes really comes from Bulwer-Lytton. It comes from the coming race. And then I discovered that the first Comic Con was Vril themed. It was called the Vril Bazaar, and it was held in 1891 at Royal Albert Hall of all things. And it was like cosplay. It was just flat out San Diego Comic Con, except for you had like landed gentry manning the booths. It was just absolutely surreal to discover this. This is several years after Lord Lytton's death. But if you actually read Vril, it's really interesting because it's actually cautionary. It's actually kind of a warning. It's like these if these kind of people exist in real life, they're going to be like tremendously authoritarian and also extremely boring. And I think that's kind of germane to what's happening in the culture at large, where the superhero power is given to very dark authoritarian impulses by computer technology. But there's just so much content there, and all these years I've wanted to do a book on pulps, particularly the pulps and the occult and the pulps and magic, because if you look at those old pulps, you had like the Rosicrucians were always advertising and those things, and theosophy had a huge impact on that stuff. I mean, all those early pulp guys like Edgar Rice Burroughs and so on,
Exactly. Yeah.
very heavily influenced by the theosophists. I mean, even Lovecraft, who we've talked about. Lovecraft was the whole Cthulhu mythos really comes from theosophy, and also Alice Bailey. And the thing that I've been really looking at, the overall context of all this is how much this all comes from the Watchers, because the Watchers, really are reintroduced to Europe through the rediscovery of the Book of Enoch by Lord Bruce. And Lord Bruce, had like a specifically Masonic uh, directive to find Enoch, because the Masons had seen, Enoch as like he was the first Mason, he was the founding father, and they wanted to create like this new mythos based around Enoch and so on. And I think that if you read Vril again, if you read Vril, they are the Watchers.
So
They're the
tell
Watchers.
people, like, I know the story. I haven't read it. Give people the real back cover.
Okay, so Vril was written by Lord-Lytton, who was kind of like the Stephen King of his time. He was a best-selling novelist, but he was also fairly high up in the aristocracy. He was actually offered the kingship of Greece, like he was offered the throne of Greece when King Otto abdicated, and he refused it. But he was also like in charge of the Foreign Office and so on, like the Office of the Colonies, that kind of thing. And his son was like this brutal, viceroy of India, and was really responsible for a lot of the kind of colonial atrocities that took place there. But so he had written a number of books, and they're all a lot of them are still pretty readable. I mean, one of them is called Zanoni, and it's really about
Mm.
it's just flat out alchemy, occult magic,
Yeah.
Rosicrucianism, just up and down the line. And then he wrote a book called The Last Days of Pompeii, which has a heavy subplot with like the ISIS mysteries. So, and this guy really, he was very well read, but he was also kind of like, the typical Victorian dandy type, And but one of the last books that I think it was the last thing that he had written while he was alive, and it was published pseudonymously, was Vril, the Coming Race, or the Power of the Coming Race, or the Coming Race. I mean, there's all these different variations on the title, but it's basically, one of these stories that had become very popular in the Victorian era, particularly with things like Atlantis and the Hollow Earth. I mean, Jules Verne and Journey to the Center of the Earth, all this kind of stuff. So it's the whole idea of like the Hollow Earth and discovering this race that he calls a race of Aryans, quote unquote, and they're basically the fallen angels. I mean, it's basically the Watchers. I mean, they fly around with wings and stuff, and they're much taller than us. But there's all this kind of like interesting um, technology stuff in there. Like they have like music piped into their houses and so on. And it's not as shocking as that Verne story where it's like they have the internet and all this kind of stuff. But it's still pretty remarkable. But that stuff was being discussed at the time. And so it's basically playing off all these kind of master race things, all this ideology that was going around during that time. And it was also kind of informed by the occult and so on. And it's basically this guy gets lost. He's exploring this cave with his friend, and they fall down the shaft, and the friend is killed. And then he discovers just basically this parallel underground society of, cousins of humanity, so on. And they have, they it's just so much the Watchers, though. I mean, like they were sent underground during the flood, you know, and they acclimated. They acclimated to the whole environment, and they build this just massive complex of cities and so on. And the book itself there's no plot. It's just basically all just a giant exposition dump of this character who's an American, by the way, which is kind of interesting. This American sort of going around and looking at these people and just making observations of their lives and their lifestyles and so on. The giants, not like 12 feet, but they're like 7 feet tall, and the women are more aggressive than the men, and they take the initiative in like sexual relations and so on. So it's kind of like a lot of that kind of uh, I don't even know what you call it, like proto-feminism almost. And so it's just basically this just long travelogue, and he's just describing all the things that he sees. And then, it ends with like, I hope these people never decide to come to the surface because they're just going to wipe us out. But kind of leaving the impression that they will, they're eventually going to outgrow their underground lairs. So this book just became like just lit a fire. It became really, really popular. And as I said, the first Comic-Con, which was the Vril Bazaar, and the way they describe it, just like it must have been a really amazing thing to see, because how all those artisans who worked in the opera and so on. I mean, they could really get this shit done. I mean, they know what they were doing, probably more than we do today. Well, actually, definitely more than we
Yeah.
could do today. But they had like mannequins with wings flying around, like on these tracks on the ceiling and so on. And then there's like Bovril, which is a sort of beef broth drink that was inspired by it. And then later on, we have the semi-legendary, maybe the Brill Society, of which a lot of mythology has been tacked on. I mean, it's very highly likely that there actually was a Brill Society, but it was probably more like a fandom kind of thing rather than like, Maria Orsic and these witches with long hair that they use as antennas, for the astral plane and all this kind of thing. So I mean, it really just lit a fire, and I think it had a lot to do with a lot of these attitudes that informed, like the Golden Dawn and all these kind of people. Just this idea of apotheosis, becoming gods. Sort of informed like the underpinnings of Darwinism, like we're on the evolutionary cusp of godhood. And
Yeah. So
it
that's the
kind of fit
part.
into that.
Yeah, that's the part that I think is really interesting about the Victorian era around then, right? Is it's actually you get a kind of unconscious response to like the peak of scientific materialism is really around the 1890s, give or take, when
Hmm.
it's like
Hmm.
everything's a fucking machine, and the the pull inside normal humans to that is into a response like from the unconscious and so on, but it's also inflected by what's around it. So it's a really interesting time, right? So you've got this sort of machine universe at its most potent, and some lessons or understanding learned from that kind of moves into something that feels better, like the 19th century esotericism, theosophy, and so on, which is why you have and kind of creepy stuff like these are different races, and the word vril is associated with stuff further across in the continent, right? So that's all this kind of 19th century fecund, potent, like compost for things to grow in, right? And that's where Enoch and the Bruce Codex, and which is actually 18th century, but funnily enough called that kind of thing, come from. That kind of idea, I think, if it had landed in any other soil, it wouldn't have grown the way it grew. It had to have been like a 19th century kind of like high Victorian soil.
And
And
Brit and in Britain too, like
yeah, exactly.
Imperial
Well,
Britain. Yeah.
because that was even, I mean, so 1890 was 11 years after or before she was going to die. She seemed eternal at that point, and the
Mm.
Victorian Empire seemed eternal at that point. It's like
Hmm.
we are plainly at the top of everything. How do we explain that to ourselves, and how does that feature in our culture? And I think it's one of the reasons it has such a long shadow is that um, that imperial confidence, which not just the British Empire, which is gone, but the American Empire, which is about to be gone. It's that same like uh internal questioning. It's like, how do I understand the universe with me being plainly superior? Right? And what does that mean? Why am I different? And I think that's which I know we broadly agree on, the long-term interest in what you can call it ancient aliens or whatever, amongst wealthy families, is that attempt to explain like well, I'm different from the pores, which means I must be like these guys, right? And there's a sort of there's an interest in these extra dimensional beings, these watchers, these whoever they happen to be. Used to call them elusive companions, right? Like these beings that are around. And so the two things I want to talk about there is like, which we are now, pulps and the soil that this strange thing grew in. Because I think you're right. As you look at the 20th century, it's that same story underpinning much of popular culture. So how we look at who has agency there always interests me. It's like, is this a long-term plot? Not really. I mean, there are parts of it, sure. There are believers who are seeking to like make the universe look more like their beliefs, but there are also, I feel like, the beings themselves are involved, right? Because it's quite a coup, really, to be in a hidden book and then end up being superheroes, right? Like that's pretty good. Yeah, their net worth goes up, right? So I don't know, like. I'd be very interested to read your book on pulps, I think, because it is definitely a fecund time that is under-examined, I would say, from a synchromistic perspective.
Well, one thing that I'd add, I mean, I agree with everything you just said. One thing I would add, though, is I think that there's an element of like imperial anxiety, um, you know, because you're on the heels of Rome, and then you have Gibbon writing that huge volume of books, just basically coming from his sort of like Masonic, scientific, rationalist worldview, and saying, well, this is how the Romans fell. So that they were well aware that empires fall, that empires rise and fall. And I think that this whole yearning for super apotheosis, let's just say, or if not yourself, maybe then through alliance, and in this case with the Watchers. And I just done this big thing on Alice Bailey because um I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I mean, she wrote a lot about the Watchers, and like her whole view is, and she says this in uncharacteristically clear language, that the Watchers were sent by God. Like they didn't fall because of their sin or whatever. They're sinless. They were the greatest angels. They sacrificed themselves to bring this cosmic consciousness down to earth. And they're the most obedient. And it's actually like Michael and Uriel and Gabriel and Raphael and all these other ones, that they're the she uses the whole analogy of the prodigal son. But I mean, clearly Bailey was working on behalf of somebody in British intelligence. I mean, I think that whole operation was just British intelligence up and down the line. The thing I found interesting that I discovered is that, like, Lucis Trust headquarters is right across the street from the Ministry of Defense in Westminster, which is just like, you can't even make that up. But the reason I bring this up, though, is that I think that superheroes seem to arise at a certain point in the lifespan of empires. And it has to do with just this, oh, yeah, okay, we're on top, but where do we go from here? Is the only way to go down? We have to, transcend ourselves. We have to become godlike. We need to find this power out there. We need to find this source. And this is when you start to see, like, the searches for Atlantis, with Ignatius Donnelly and so on. That there's this real need to tap into this ancient power that's been lost. You know what I'm saying? And, it reminds me what you said about the early archaeologists, how they just basically, went to Mesopotamia with a Bible and a shovel,
Yeah.
and I don't think that was out of intellectual curiosity. I think they were searching, for this ancient power that somehow gets lost. And it's this myth, and this shows up, with the superheroes in America, in the late 30s with the Depression, right? And the onset of World War II. So you have a tremendous amount of imperial anxiety there as well, don't you? I mean, you have basically, everybody was flat broke for most of the 30s, and then we see the rise of Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini, you know, these strongmen and these dictators. And it's just very interesting that if you read the early Superman stories before he sort of became like, you know, I'm going to borrow this from Batman, but like the Caped Crusader, you know, he's the original story that Siegel had written was very much like of a dictator, of a strong man. And again, I mean, I think you can't separate all this from like the impulses and the directives of empire. And I would say the same thing about Golden Dawn and, you know,
Sure.
Astrum Argentum and you name it. I mean, I don't think you can separate them two. And you know, the thing that I really came to the realization of in this light, since all this stuff kind of is midwifed by Freemasonry, right? I mean, you have sort of the earlier antecedents going back to ancient myth, and then you have like sort of this strange period where like all these monks and these monasteries are sort of reading Ovid again, right? And then that sort of later becomes, I guess maybe the Templars and then the Rosicrucians. I mean, there's this sort of lineage being passed down where this kind of information is being transmitted, but it's really the Masons. And the thing that I really came to see is that the Masons is, you know, it's inseparable from empire. It's kind of like an imperial knighthood. And it's like, so you're planting your flag in all these other countries, right? And you say, well, listen, yeah, I know we're here from, you know, Great Britain, the British Empire, and you know, we're nominally Christian, but you know, that's not real we really believe. You know, behind the scenes, we're into this other thing, this universalist thing that everybody can join, you know, and that's how you start to pick, you know, you start to cherry pick all the influencers, let's just say, in these other countries that you're trying to conquer and exploit. So it's interesting to me, and I don't know if I had this kind of sense as much when I actually wrote Our Gods Were Spandex, which I wrote 2005, 2006. Um, but just the understanding the larger issues here, that it isn't just about like a bunch of nerds exercising power fantasies, that there is like this larger context here. And this is, you know, when you talk about imperial anxieties, look at how the superhero boom in this century really starts in the wake of 9/11. You know,
Yeah.
Spider-Man, X-Men 2, Iron Man, Batman Begins. I mean, all these things sort of arise in that context, and so many of these films kind of in important ways kind of reference that. You understand what I'm saying? So I think that was, you know, kind of driving that. But at the
Yeah.
same time,
I
there's
think
this.
part of that anxiety though is this is one of the things I think about often when it comes to this is like that 19th century idea of the white man's burden. So what you do when you realize you're at the top is like, well, what do I do? Like, does this end, or like, what is my obligation? Like, there is an anxiety there because I think about X-Men and other stuff post 9/11. That's essentially a story of like an elite paramilitary group that saves and improves the world, right? So you're essentially fighting terrorism with it. And if you look at Superman doing public health stuff in, you know, in the post-war era, it's this idea of white man anxiety, like the white man's burden. If people are unfamiliar with the term, it's a Victorian idea that because we are plainly superior, we are burdened with bringing civilization and improvement to the rest of the world, right? And that's in there with stuff like the Golden Dawn. that kind of, it's almost like that's a source for the anxiety as well as the fear of it not ending. But you can see where both of them pull you to looking for ancient civilizations, to either it's almost like rocks that you want to touch, like to remove anxiety. Like it'd be really, really good to have Babylon, and which they did. You know, the British Empire kind of like collected ancient cities, and everyone keeps looking for Atlantis, right? It's that idea of, it's really tribal, really primal idea of keeping hold of ancient things. Maybe you can stave off, maybe you can stave off the decline by finding their wisdom, and this is, I think, the bit that is real Darwinian or evolutionary, is because Darwinism applied to humans is like a malformed Gnosticism, right? So this idea of kind of like escape up is a pretty good source, a pretty good coping mechanism for anxiety. Like you can kind of understand it, right, on a society or upper echelon level.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the but there's also like a reverse of that. So I hear what you're saying about the white man's burden. That was didn't Kipling coin that term?
Yeah,
Right. Okay, yeah.
yeah,
But there's also kind of a reverse because with the pulp heroes, and this is what I was talking about with the Shadow and Batman Begins. Like they wander off. They like so many of them like go to Tibet, right, and discover Shambhala or its equivalents, and learn these ancient superpowers of these monks, on these far mountain redoubts. You know what I'm saying? So there is like a two-way kind of connection going on there. So there is what you're saying, right? And the imperial anxiety and seeing these ancient cultures in places like India and China, which just have so much longer and deeper history than the West. But also, like we need to get their power. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
this
exactly.
this is
Yeah,
it. The thing that's interesting in this regard is just like how much of particularly Nazism had like was so geeky. You know what I mean? There was such like a nerdy kind of geeky uh, component to it, and it's that 7 years in Tibet and so on, and like the SS would the what was it, the Institute for Racial Hygiene would be sending all these uh, expeditions to Tibet, and because there's this whole idea that this was like the origin point of the Aryan race and so on like that. So when you see all these different, in particular the pulp heroes, um, they go to the exotic and the unknown, the East, the Orient. They go there to study under these masters, and really, so the Shadow is that's definitely part of his origin. And then there was a character called the Green Llama, right? Another pulp superhero, and he had this very explicit, like he's a llama, right? So there's this whole idea that these llamas were superheroes, and there's always this impulse, that the answer to these questions and these powers and these deeper truths is always somewhere else. You know what I'm
yeah,
saying? I mean, this goes back to the Greeks with Dionysus and so on. Phrygia seems to be like the hot spot for a lot of, and it's always like these kind of like mountainous areas too. Like so there's something about like the altitude that just adds to these super heroic potentials. But again, I mean, it's all about, to me, it's all about ultimately, staving off mortality. It's about fear of death, whether it's personal death or the death of your culture or the death of your empire. And how do you go about, um, you know, cheating the Reaper, basically? And superpowers and the superheroes and so on, major part of that, right? And arise, like I said, at the dawn of the Second World War, and then after the war is over, they kind of just basically die out, and then they're revived after Sputnik, with the Cold War heating up, because like there's this whole idea, the space race, quote unquote, right? And that fires what's called the Silver Age of the superheroes. And again, like we said, the whole thing with 9/11. But you can't separate magic and the occult um, from the pulp heroes, certainly. And a lot of the early superheroes too. I mean, a lot of the early superheroes are just basically taking the cues from the pulps. Green Lantern. I mean, Green Lantern in the Silver Age and the Space Age gets his powers from an alien, right?
yeah,
But the original one's like, it's this whole idea of like these magical monks somewhere, that give you your powers. And you know, and a great example to me is Captain Marvel, aka Shazam. I mean, you know, it's this kid who gets lost in the subway tunnel and discovers like this ancient wizard underneath the ground who gives them in the you know explicitly the power of the gods. You know, Shazam is, you know, it's what is it? Whatever. You know, it's whatever those here. So it's Solomon, Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, and Mercury. So you know the power of the gods and the demigods and so on. And this, I think, in a lot of ways, um, creates this sort of middle ground. So we have like, you talk about the real hardcore cult, the Crowley level, right? Or the Golden Dawn level, you know, Mathers and so on. And then you have like the great unwashed, you know, the masses. And then you have this sort of medium for this information to come from these esoteric and occult sects and so on. And it's fed into the public mind through the pulps and through the comic books. And I don't think people really kind of appreciate like how I hate to use the term revolutionary, but like how radical and unprecedented that is. That we have this kind of shift in the emphasis of the culture that's being fed by these groups and these figures that you know polite society sees as just being completely unacceptable. You know, but for the same token, like the pulps and the hero out of this comic books were pretty you know, they were not socially acceptable either. But you know, this is a long process that sort of like I said, I think it's entered its terminal point now. Where
Yeah.
it's interesting to be talking about this now when we're really seeing the end of it. You know, and this is something
No,
I've been
well,
talking about for a couple of
it's
years now.
funny, right? Like this imperial collapse happens without them for reasons we want to get to, but I want to ask a bit more about Alice Bailey stuff first, right? And then I want to work out what these beings are and what that did, if that makes sense. Like
Hmm.
it's interesting to observe that um, popular culture filled itself for now with stories of, including some often quite detailed information, like Zanoni is a good example, uh,
Mm,
filled itself with like almost actionable esoteric practices. Right now, we
hmm.
can't all be, and it's funny, like even you look at the early superheroes, it's that same kind of shadow shape of esoteric wisdom is kind of implied with Bruce Wayne anyway, because it's like he's a rich, reclusive weirdo in like a palace filled with odds and ends, like um, Asian masks and stuff. So it's sort of implied with at the very beginning. But so we have this shape of like males for the most part, overwhelmingly, who have this esoteric knowledge which they kind of like use in the world. And I want to come back to that, but I want to ask, like, what if Alice Bailey was British intelligence, what was the point of it?
I think that there are watcher cults within
Okay,
the and you know I've discussed this with you,
sure.
um, and you know there's a lot of evidence that kind of backs that belief up. I've seen a lot of these kind of public rituals. I honestly believe that there are watcher cults, and I honestly believe that you know when Bruce went to Ethiopia to find First Enoch, you know that was part of the plan. You know,
Mhm.
I don't know if they necessarily had the knowledge of the Watchers. I mean, because the Watchers are certainly presented as kind of villainous, right? In Enoch, right? They're disobedient. They disobey the whims of God. And but it's also this whole idea of technology, right? I mean, I think this is what made it so potent to you know the Victorian Empire, which is basically an empire of technology, because the Victorian Empire is coinciding with the Industrial Revolution. So it's
Yeah,
like technology is lending them this immense power, you know, where the sun never sets on their empire. But there's also, you know, I don't know if how much this was on the minds, but it's like there's also the idea that you know technologies, you can't monopolize them forever. You know, the technologies are going to get out. You know, other people are going to start to use these technologies, and that's where I think this whole idea of like apotheosis comes in. So it's like it's not enough to rely on these technologies, to rely on the science, right? To rely on the industrial revolution. We need to become better than we are. Okay. And traditionally, I mean, you know this, traditionally throughout the history of ritual magic and so on, you know, you become better than you are through the patronage of entities or beings, or you know, the Great White Brotherhood, and you know what I'm saying, like all the stuff that we see in theosophy, uh you know, the Grand Lodge of Sirius and the Bailey stuff. You know, you reach apotheosis through you know, the patronage and the assistance of entities that are greater than yourself. And that's what I think the appeal is. And like I said, I mean, I just discovered this recently, and it was really kind of by accident, because I did this live stream on um, King Charles, or King Chuck E. Cheese, as I like to call him, and his very you know, disgusting friends. You know, he's close. I mean, basically, Jimmy Savile was almost a royal advisor for, you know, for all intents and purposes. I mean, he and, you know, Savile and Charles were extremely close. And you know, he would have like Savile like interview people, you know, who wanted to have positions within the, you know, the court and so on. So, but anyhow, so that sort of got me on, you know, the history of the Windsors and so on. And then Bulwer-Lytton sort of enters the frame, and that got me reading Brill, and then Brill got me reading Bailey again. And like I said, I was just stunned by how explicit she is about the Watchers. That, you know, the Watchers, you know, so you know the figure of Sanat Kumara, you know, that's
Sure.
the coming one, who's also Lord Maitreya, right? I mean, all these kind of titles, I guess, for basically the same figure. She describes him as the leader of the Watchers. You know, he's the silent watcher, she calls them. And she uses the term watchers over and over again. She talks about fallen angels. And like I said before, I mean, in her estimation and in her theology, really, the fallen angels, she calls them the lords of sacrifice. You know, they sacrifice themselves to bring this knowledge to humanity, you know. And this was not like in defiance of the celestial court. I mean, this was, you know, this was on orders from the top dog himself. So I just started to realize that this is like an extremely potent mythology, you know, that I think would have tremendous appeal for a lot of people who are kind of like, you know, they're tired of the old sort of Abrahamic worldview, and they're not ready to sign on to the atheistic or the nihilistic worldview. And like, you know, under this whole Watcher theology that she developed, I mean, you can fold in whatever you like from you know, from Western religion, Western mythology, Eastern religion. You know, it can all. It's like a format almost that you can start plugging
So
all these things into.
that brings me back to what you said earlier, which I've been meaning to pick up on. I don't think, because I'm obsessed with this, I don't think people realize that the Imperial worldview is a worldview. We just think it's being ecumenical or something, right? So they
It
get to
just is.
India. Yeah, like they get to India and it's like, cool, we're Anglican, you're Hindu. That's like everyone can like do their thing. That's a worldview. That's a worldview that is that enables the arrival of beings like this, because you have to be able to think that way to come into awareness of beings like the Watchers, right? Because otherwise you're in the framework that you're in. So the consciously or not, the Imperial framework allows for, and not in a good way, like, well, over the long term, right? Because what it actually does is makes itself the dominant framework for the whole world, and then everything else
Mhm.
is underneath it. But in that dominance, it allows that interplay, and so that's the worldview that encountered Enoch in Ethiopia, right? So a worldview that is already kind of aware that, let's just say, well, certainly Anglicanism, but let's just say Christianity is just a take, right? And Hinduism is a take. And so you actually have more intellectual and moral room to do things, because this thing that we've mistaken for reality, this imperial worldview, allows for the emergence of this, and to have, highly placed predatory pedophiles near the King of England, who himself was very likely diddled by Lord Mountbatten, and that's where he got the habit, right? So,
you mean the present King of England? Yes.
yes, yeah. And that people don't like. The imperial worldview is a worldview of, facilitates a certain kind of relationship with extra dimensional beings, because it relativizes previous frameworks, and it's satanic in its deviousness, that you can't see it, that you actually mistake it for reality until you see it. And I think that's when I look at all the pieces that feed into this, when I look at, let's say that, like, the Darwinian current, and the current that runs alongside that, which was the early anthropological current, which is kind of tips that profound racism and acquisitional nature into this project. All of these things feed into a worldview that allows this stuff to emerge from wherever things emerge from, right? Like the imaginal, the collective unconscious. And so that's kind of where we want to go with the conversation. Is it's all well and good to catalog these routes of influence, but that's really actually just like almost like setting up the Stargate for the appearance of these things from wherever they come from. And why that's important to me now is that these, whatever you want to call them, archetypes, et cetera, these agentic imaginal beings are on their way out. And as we kind of discussed last night, my morning, your time, I shared a video with the gay Superman is ending after 18 issues or what have you. This archonic being that's coming to destroy, or attempting to destroy, everything. It's like it attacks sites of like potent resistance, potent imaginal resistance or alternatives, and it colonizes them from the inside, right? So we're actually going through a collapse. And so are these archetypes. Like, they're not, Superman is not available to us, and they're trying to take, Gandalf and the rest of them away with rings of power, right? Like these deep sources of imaginal allyship, which were there before, currently aren't. And I fancy that's significant. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, to be honest with you. First of all, like the gay Superman and all the stuff that they're doing with the comic books, particularly. You have to understand, the natures of the market. But basically, what comics are becoming is basically just slash fiction. It's not even fan fiction anymore.
Yeah.
It's basically slash fiction, because they're really trying to lean into the the young kind of non-binary, or female, or just that sort of world that reads YA, because boys don't read. They just don't. And they read less and less. So you had like this huge influx of fans, in my generation, and it was never replenished, really. I mean, you had like popularity in the 90s with comics, but that was still Gen X. So the
millennials don't read anyway. Like, millennials read young adult. That's Twilight and Harry Potter. Zoomers
but that's the same. Those are superheroes.
Totally. But what I find fascinating about this sort of like market attempt to find a younger audience is it's like a pedophile with his van holding candy out, but there are no kids on the street. Like, these people aren't there. It's this, like, I find it really, really, and it's definitely not fan fiction, because I said this about Rings of Power, because these people hate the material. It's enemy fiction. They're actually seeking to destroy this thing because they think they can do it better, right? And I find this, so it's all like, I agree completely that there's market forces. It's like, oh, we have to go and get the youngs because Gen X are aging out of buying comics. So we'll do some sort of non-binary purple-haired Batwoman, bat them, right? But the people who would read that do not exist. It's not that there aren't, non-binary people. It's that no one's reading it. No Zoomers are reading shit. And this is fascinating to me. This is fascinating that, as far as I can tell, the appearance of it, like the archetypal appearance of beings like this at the end of empires that happened with Rome, which was lousy with soothsayers and sorcerers and all the rest of it. This time we're kind of doing it without those beings because we're killing them. This is weird. You know what I mean?
I see. I don't know if I see it that way. I mean, I see what's going on. I mean, there's so many facets to it, and some which are contradictory. But ultimately, I have what I call Knowles's laws. And, like the first law is whenever there's a controversy about symbolism in the media, it's usually disguising a completely different symbolic message altogether. But also, like, the ancient state cults will be reinstated under the cover of woke. And that's what we're seeing everywhere. I mean, the example I always bring up is like this woke public education directive in California wanted to have kids pray to the gods of Aztec human sacrifice in class and so on, and slathered it with this whole woke cover. I think listen. I mean, I really think that there is powerful cult of people who have, I don't know if they've fallen into it or they actually believe it, but like I said, this whole watcher adoration. And this ties into, I mean, there's so many things that tie into this, but the thing that I've pointed out, because you mentioned Harry Potter and Twilight, like I said, I mean, these are all kind of variations on the same mythology, right? I mean, it's like those are superheroes, but they're not necessarily heroic. They're superhumans who aren't necessarily heroic. I mean, I really, I've always kind of felt that Harry Potter is kind of sinister, I mean, because it's like it creates this dichotomy between muggles and humans. And then, I mean, the magicians or the witches or whatever they are, and they have their own school and they have their own railroad and they have their own little shopping center, Diagonal Alley and so on. It's like they just have this completely parallel civilization. That's the real breakaway civilization. But I mean, also all these, I mean, a great example recently with Marvel is the Eternals. I mean, the movie was a huge flop, but the Eternals are the Watchers, just straight up. And I'm sure Kirby was familiar because Kirby invented the original Eternals, which don't have much to do with the Eternals in the movie. But I mean, even in the movie, they're basically watchers. They're just sort of watching what's going on. Like, why didn't they do anything about Thanos, trying to destroy half the planet, whatever? Because that's not the job. The job is to like watch and wait for these, these celestials to come back. So when you really start to look at all these things, there has been like almost like a process of entrainment through these shows that aim towards kids, whether it's so you can have like the magicians or the vampires, or Once Upon a Time has the like fairy tale characters and they're all immortals, and then you have American gods. I mean, there's this whole stack of these things. I mean, heroes again is another example. Interestingly enough, I mean, they keep pushing this stuff, and most of these things don't really find like a mainstream audience. I mean, most of them kind of die on the vine, but that doesn't stop them. And I think that there's an agenda. So when you talk about like breaking down the old heroes or breaking down the old archetypes, I think it's part of the process. I mean, I think there is a process
I
going
think
on.
it is part of the process, but I'm not sure that is an operation perpetrated by a cult of human watcher worshippers. I think it's like I was listening to Charles Eisenstein in a different context talking about conspiracies and whatever yesterday, but I think whilst plainly there are watcher cults, I'm not, no, that's fine. Well, we can call them that, but we both know what we're talking about when we say this, right? Whatever you want to call them. But I think they happen in the context of a reality that is bringing these things closer to the surface in the imaginal anyway. So I'm kind of looking at it from that perspective. That's why, like, I half wrote this post in the jungle called The Synchromysticism of the Apocalypse, where, because I was reading Jung's Man and His Symbols, which is worse than I remember, except for his essay. But there's a quote that I pulled out that I was going to use for the post that I want to read now, because I think this is sort of what I mean by it, which is, modern man does not understand how much his rationalism, which has destroyed his capacity to respond to numinous symbols and ideas, has put him at the mercy of the psychic underworld. He has freed himself from superstition, or so he believes, but in the process he has lost his spiritual values to a positively dangerous degree. His moral and spiritual tradition has disintegrated, and he is now paying the price for this breakup in worldwide disorientation and dissociation. And like he described at the eve of World War, that, well, it feels like we're standing on a volcano, that no one is, like, there's nowhere to go when this blows. Like, that's what it felt like to him, and it's sort of like that now. This is kind of what I mean. Like, I want these beings that show up because we had an imperial cosmology that made it so that we could see them again, and then kind of like had their merry way with the last 150 years, for better and for worse. And now we're facing essentially the end of the West without them, because there's this other being, like, it's classic Gnosticism or classic, I don't know, Middle Earth, that this being is picking off the sites of imaginal resistance. And so I think it's happening at that level, which can in fact inform deliberate pushes in the level of physical. That's kind of what I meant by, I'm interested to speculate as to the agency of the beings involved, the kind of like archon that's fucking destroying anything that had archetypal depth or richness to it, as doing its own thing. It certainly has foot soldiers, let's say, in the human, but that's kind of what I meant by, I think, sites of imaginal refuge, if not resistance, because that's what they were, right? Like, you remember that for comic books. I remember it from Middle Earth. This was a site of refuge. that's where you go when reality is shit, and reality's colonized it. It's attempting to make it shit, and that just looks like a spirit, a military tactic to me at the level of spirit. That's kind of what I meant. What do you think?
Well, there is a direct precedent for this, and that's in the 4th century Rome, where after the signing of the Edict of Milan, where all religions would be tolerated under the empire, you had this methodical, very patient program to tear down all the old pagan temples, replace them with churches, close all the academies, close all the mystery centers, close the oracle centers. And it took most of the 4th century to do this, right? I mean, it's not till Theodosius where then it becomes under pain of death. But there is this process unfolding that is remarkably like ours, right? And I'm sure that whoever is carrying this out on the physical realm, probably studied that program. It's a paradigm shift in the culture, and culture. I don't use culture in the sort of the small, like this little hobby that we have. I mean culture in the awareness,
Sure.
the global awareness, or the awareness of a country or a people. I mean, I definitely think that there is, that program has resumed. And that's why I said, like, woke is a great way to do this undercover. Just to break all the old things down and bring the new thing in, and keep everybody sort of sidelined and quiet with the powers of woke.
Agreed, but I don't think that the thing that they're bringing in is the old gods. I would be in favor of that. I would like to see, Asclepius healing temples and sleep centers and whatever come back. Even the Aztec thing, it's like a mockery of gods. Like it's Morgothian. They're actually setting up temples to this one entity, right? Like this one archon, this one demiurge. So that's the bit that I'm kind of like, I don't think they're bringing in like old state religions. I think they're bringing in this thing.
Well, no, by old state religions, I don't mean like, we're gonna have temples of Zeus and so on.
Yeah.
Right? I mean just the infrastructure of the old state religions.
Yeah,
where,
that's definitely true.
it's a true totalitarianism where everything is working together, and probably a better precedent or example for this would be like Sumer, Babylon, where like everything was connected. The priesthood would run like the farms and so on. I
Yeah.
mean, it was everything was centered in
Love it.
a totalizing way. I mean,
Yeah.
the Watcher cult, and maybe it won't be the dominant paradigm, but the more I read it, like I just think, oh, this is like evil genius. I mean, the way
Yeah.
Bailey, or not Bailey herself, but her British intelligence ghostwriters set this all up, is that when you sort of, we're seeing this conflict east and west, and then we're seeing all these other conflicts, racial, ethnic, and then cultural, political. Everything is, the polarization is just accelerating, right? The one thing that I keep thinking of, and this is where we can bring the UFO thing in, is I remember 25 years ago listening to this guy named Dave Emery, who was he's still around, but he's sort of this outlier conspiracy theorist. But he had talked about the UFO thing and how the UFO thing was part of a program where you were going to have the situation where there would be famine and war and depression and just overall privation, and that this kind of quasi blue beam fake UFO, and this is actually before blue beam. This is actually, he was talking about the stuff pre blue beam. So I'm sure that whoever wrote Blue Beam for Serge Monas was influenced by it. But so this whole idea that everything is just going to get really terrible, and then the saucers are going to land, right? The saviors are coming. Our space brothers are coming. And the fact that we're seeing mainstream media, New York Times, CNN, whomever, push the UFO thing so heavily after like decades of just doing nothing but outright slamming it and mocking it, really makes me wonder if, like, I mean, maybe he wasn't right on all the details, but maybe the overall thesis is correct. It's like the next gods will be the star gods, the space brothers. And, we've had 15 years of ancient aliens sort of warming everybody up for this idea. And like, even people don't watch it, or they don't believe it or pay attention to it. I mean, it's been fed into the culture, right? And it's been fed into the culture before that. I mean, through all these, going back to at least 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I did a breakdown on that. And it's like that's the Watchers again. I mean, the original story, Clark is the Sentinels, right?
Yeah.
Or the Sentinel, or the Sentinel of Eternity. It goes under either name, but it's the same thing. It's like this monolith comes down and basically teaches these hominids how to do everything, right? So but then Clark, don't forget, Clark also wrote Childhood's End, which is another spin on the Watchers. These overlords, they're called the overlords in the book. They come down and they stop all the wars and stop all the famines and all this kind of stuff. But they wait 50 years for like all the old people to die off before revealing themselves, and they kind of look like just like classic demons with the horns and the wings and all bat wings and so on. So I think that if you were looking for how this would really be reintroduced to modern culture, I think like UFOs and all that other stuff will be the medium for it. I don't think like, so there's no doubt in my mind that there are Watcher cults, right? And I mean, I've just really pulled out all this symbolism that I couldn't believe when I found it. It was like it was looking for me or whatever. But I think the UFO, it'll come. The next phase will come. If we truly are looking at the same kind of process that we saw in 4th century Rome, with the destruction of the pagan world, and then this new worldview planted atop of it. I think in this century, it'll be, the Space Brothers, absolutely. The
Yeah.
Watchers will be recast as the Space Brothers, but it will be the same basic idea.
The UFO op is a good example for people who are looking for, well, do you have an example of a multi-decade approach or attempt to manipulate and change the worldview of a whole planet? You go, yes, I do. I have the UFO op. I have it being, obviously it's been handed to different hands over the last 40 or 50 years, but especially in the last 8, it's in the hands of people who have every intention, at the very least, of using it as air cover for their military devices that we're not supposed to know exist. Now, that can certainly go further, because there's all kinds of, if you can get people on the hook for that, you can get them on the hook for a childhood and Great Reset, right? Where
ultimate reset.
But it's like the Space Brothers dictating that you're supposed to be eating bugs and living in this, what they consider to be pristine environment, and so on. So there's certainly air cover in this artificial worldview. It's just that, to me, it looks, again, I come back to, it looks more like technocrats using this rather than cultists who are using it. But it brings me back to, nevertheless,
you're implying there's a difference, though, and I don't believe.
No, I definitely am. I like, Klaus is not in a watcher cult, is my point. But what we end up with, this comes back to the kind of Jungian thing I want to go with, is the net effect is the same, which is that we end up, whether the people who've implemented it or not understand it as such, we've ended up with a cosmology that is, for all intents and purposes, like you would like a totalitarian religious one after the model of Sumer or Babylon. Like, we still end up in a world that a watcher cult would want. And that brings me back to, like, well, who has the agency here? Do you know what I mean? Like, are there other beings? And the way I think about it of late, and the guys who've just finished the energy healing course are aware of this, like, the Sutuhil Maya cosmology believes that humans, our function is to feed the holy with beauty. And that's why like, Mayan women have these incredibly beautiful, like, colorful clothing and what have you, with little bells on it, because the simple act of walking to the river to get water or so on is supposed to be beautiful, because we feed the gods with beauty. And that's what humans do. We do it with music. That's what ceremony is. We feed them and they feed us, and that's the cycle. There are other beings that are fed by other stuff other than beauty, right? They are fed by cruelty and privation and control, right? Like that cool, comforting, all the trains are running on time and everyone's checking in with their QR code and what have you. So the beings are real, for sure, right? And that's the bit where I'm like, I don't I agree, again, like, we can call them different things. You can say angel cult, but you just have to look at the grimoires and who used them over the last 500 years to know that the people who have the big country piles in England were fucking about with grimoires and little scrying stones. And what were they talking to? They're talking to angels or spirits or what have you. So 100%.
Yeah, but watchers are angels, though. I mean,
correct. That's my point. So, like, I'm not saying that these cults aren't there. I look at the agency from, like, the imaginal, from these beings in, and I find that, like, a more satisfying map, if that makes sense.
Well, I want to tie in, what I covered on Lucifer's technologies, because I think that's another moving part in this. We had, listen, I'm entirely agnostic on the ultimate truth of these things, but all I can say is I can point at the events leading up to Roswell and the events around Roswell, and the use of Roswell in the popular culture is entirely ritualistic. Starting at least with the Trinity test, we just had these series of these mass ritualistic events, right? Um, you know, my favorite example is Operation Crossroads, right? What are crossroads? What do you use crossroads for, right? I mean, why would you call these tests, you know, these bomb tests, Operation Crossroads? You know, it kind of like gives you chills a little bit,
Yeah.
and you know, Project Diana and so on. But somehow out of this series of obvious rituals, you know, I mean, people like you and I understand the symbolism, and we just go, yeah, this is just ritual. I mean, this might not even have any scientific value at all, right? But it ends up with, you know, the microchip's a little bit later, but it ends up with the transistor, right? And then the integrated circuit, and then, I mean, all these kind of things that are facilitating this new empire, this technocratic empire, right, is all fed from that, just this weird little point in time, you know, particularly from Kenneth Arnold to the end of the year, and then we have Crowley dying in there, right? Crowley dies
Oh, sure.
just
Yeah.
shortly before the transistor is introduced, and so on. So again, I mean, I'm not going to try to say, oh yeah, well, you know, this demons or fallen angels or whomever, aliens, whatever, we're feeding all this technology to people, right? Um, I mean, I can have my opinions, but it's like at the end of the day, I can't objectively prove that. But I can objectively prove that there was this whole cycle of ritualism just
Sure.
drenching this whole process. And you know, the thing I point out too is that like Roswell just got pulled out of mothballs every time there was like a major paradigm shift in computing, right? So it starts off in 47, right? What's 47? That's like ENIAC, UNIAC. I mean, it's all uh, these you know, these tube driven computers that they used during the war to like calculate bombs and so on, bomb trajectories, things the size of houses, right? That's coincides with Roswell. Roswell comes out of mothballs again in the late 70s. What's that? That's the dawn of the personal computer, right? I mean, it's like the IBM, Commodore, Apple, you know, just clustered around that time, they're reintroducing this stuff. And then it comes out of mothballs again in the early 90s. And what's the early 90s? It's the rise of the World Wide Web, right? So I don't think that's you know, coincidental. I think that is part of some project, some agenda. Um, so when but you know, when you talk about Enoch and all this kind of stuff, this stuff is all over ufology. I mean,
Yeah.
Ancient Aliens did at least one full show on this topic, right? They did one whole, just a whole thing on the Watchers, and you just see this. I mean, this is where I first learned about them in the first place, was through ufology and so on. So I don't think that there's a division there. And but you know, the thing that I truly worry about is, what if they go through all this trouble of just basically destroying the world economy and world infrastructure and starting with this whole world war, and it all fails, you know, like the skies don't open, or you know, the UFOs don't land, and the fake UFOs can't get off the ground. I mean, you know, what happens when this all just turns to shit, right? Which, you know, if I was a betting man, I would
Oh,
bet
yeah,
the
totally.
farm on it all falling apart to shit and on it all failing, right? But but like I said, I mean, it's like, I know you're kind of hung up on the whole thing with the Watchers because it just seems like just such a specific thing, right? It just seems like such a specific
Well,
story.
it's not necessarily that. It's that, like, the Roswell thing's a good example. So the because I actually do think it is coinciding in the sense of it coinciding rather than a coincidence.
Hmm.
So it's a really good example of having Roswell coinciding with three kind of jumps in computing. But that to me, so to me that looks more likely, or I can frame that as an understanding better as um, the appearance of the same event in like in the physical and the imaginal, rather than like a starter pistol for like, okay, we're going to mention Roswell again, let's have the World Wide Web. Like it doesn't, that's what I say, like there are so a good example, like the Millennium Show, right? Coming back to this Sutta Hill idea of feeding the holy, like everything we do is food for the gods. That's a way, not that I'm saying this is because this is plainly an indication that there are people who have a kind of zany ancient aliens watcher belief system in halls of power in Britain, right? But even if they didn't, you do a ritual like that and you attract them, right? That's like the fucking point.
Or you attract something.
Yeah, exactly.
You try, yeah. I mean, you get something's attention. I mean, might not necessarily be who you want to get the attention of, but I think, yeah. I mean, it's very clear to me that you do get something's attention. But
Yeah.
I mean, listen. I don't think that this, bringing Roswell out of mothballs just happened. I don't think that's happenstance. I think that was deliberate.
But then, so how does that work? So that, like, okay, well, let's move Roswell into popular culture through a couple of TV shows and things, and we'll wait until then to like give people access to the World Wide Web. Like that's the bit that I don't. The coinciding works really, really well because the Alice Bailey stuff is like the prehistory to Lucifer's technologies, because her conception of Lucifer is this kind of runaway improvement in technology. It's apotheosis through that sort of like infinite exit, right? Like that's the kind of understanding of Lucifer as bringer of light and technology that is in that elite current, right? Because there are, and rightly so, different ways of characterizing Lucifer as well, or additional ways of characterizing Lucifer. So I get the idea of archetypally Roswell as a fall event, and plainly Operation Crossroads and the rest of it. I'm pretty sure we understood that from Twin Peaks and whatever. Pretty sure like we know what was going on there. So it's almost like you don't need the cults. They might be there, but I think this is the point I'm trying to make, is that they might be there, but you don't need them to have, for people listening or watching this, to marvel at the alignment, the synchronicity, the coinciding of a Roswell story and a Luciferian style improvement in computing power, which is itself essential for the kind of woke technocratic state cult that is being implemented around us now. So you actually see the thread of it, but it looks more like beings from the other side rather than like, do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? Like
I don't understand. I don't understand why there has to be a difference, though. I mean,
there doesn't. There doesn't. But it's. I'm more interested in looking at the movements in the imaginal, so that, I don't know. I think that's what I mean. I think I'm more satisfied in looking at it from the movements of the imaginal, because it credits, I think, too much power and foresight to like a subset of the elite, I guess, is where I'm going. Like I can't see how Roswell on TV and the World Wide Web work as a plan devised by humans, but certainly as a plan devised by something else.
Well, I mean, I very strongly believe in, entity possession and entity influence. That's kind of a given with me. So
Sure.
again, I mean, I don't see that there has to be a distinction. But as far as the Roswell and the computing thing, I mean, just look at the lone gunman, right? That is such a great creation because that's totally based in a reality that was happening at the time, where you had people who are early adopters, phone freaks and so on. People who aren't BBSs. People are just into computer nerds, basically. At that time, were very interested in ufology and particularly like UFO conspiracies. I mean, those characters are great because they're just a reflection of a reality. I mean, it was a very tiny subset of people, but I think that it influences the culture. And I think I see this more like, okay, it's like not like, oh, nothing happens for 30 years, and all of a sudden we pull Roswell out of mothballs because, we want to get people on personal computers. I don't think it's that stark. I think it's part of a larger framework of entrainment that has
Yeah.
been going on since at least the Victorian era. You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? So it's like like I have, I've become an extreme skeptic of space travel. Okay, and my motto is no one's going anywhere, right? And but why did I believe that in the first place? Because of the media,
Yeah.
and not only just because of the media, but because of popular culture. Watching all those episodes of Star Trek, watching the Star Wars movies, all this kind of thing prepared me, just conditioned my mind to accept this idea of space travel and going to the moon and all this nonsense. And what I see now is that was not only entrainment for the technocracy, but it's just a belief in just the basic theology, because that's really what it is. This theocratic concept of just endless progress, which
Yeah.
informs, takes us right back to the beginning of our story here, right?
Yeah.
So it's like there needs to be this carrot that the culture is chasing as a collective, constantly chasing the carrot of progress, right? And once people stop believing in that myth, this myth of progress, because it is a mythology, that's when society starts to fall apart, because you can only keep together, uh, you know, a culture, which is a collection of all different groups with all different backgrounds and interests and so on. You get them on board with this project. Everybody is on board. Everybody signs on for the progress. We're gonna have cities on Mars, and we're gonna be flying to other star systems and so on. It's never gonna happen. It's just never gonna happen. I think we've hit peak tech, right? I think peak tech is in our rearview mirror now.
Yeah.
But it's part of our social conditioning, and it's part of, like, I don't, I don't want to sound too Alex Jones about this, but it's part of a larger control matrix,
Definitely.
where we believe in things like, so, people from all over the place have all different attitudes and backgrounds, but we can get them on board with this whole idea of, like, A, endless progress, and B, like, materialism. It's kind of like these lowest common denominators that you can sort of unify people under your imperial umbrella, in other words. But once you take away that myth, you know it all falls apart. And that's what I'm saying about the thing with Roswell, is that Roswell pops up because they want to sort of create this whole idea that these aliens, that they're the ultimate avatars of progress, and they came here, and they crashed, and we discovered their miracles, and we incorporated them into our own. It's all part of, it's not as simple and direct, but it's part of a larger ecosystem of, um, basically, mythical conditioning. So when you
Okay.
talk about, when you talk about Lord of the Rings and stuff, so there's this terrible series now that everybody hates. Um, that will be forgotten. It'll be for,
Yeah. Totally.
it's new Coke, basically. All this woke shit is
Right.
basically just new Coke. You're probably too young to remember new Coke, but
I
um,
studied marketing. I know New Coke. Yeah.
okay. So
Yeah.
if your readers aren't or your listeners aren't familiar with it, basically in 1985, Coke decided they were going to, like, reinvent the wheel, and they were going to put out new Coke, and nobody could figure out, like, why they did this, what the impetus behind this was. But they just, like, new Coke, and it was just an absolute catastrophe. It was one of the worst uh, marketing disasters in modern history. And they sort of sheepishly, that it was like Coca-Cola Classic, and then it's just like
Yeah.
new Coke just vanishes. And new Coke just tasted like Pepsi. It was weird. But
Well, that was the point. They were
that
too
that
scared.
to me is
Yeah.
woke. But that, like, not woke overall. I mean, woke is multifaceted. But this, all these woke makeovers of all these superheroes and all these myths and stuff. It's just basically new Coke. It's new woke
Yep.
Coke. You know,
Yep.
it will all be forgotten by the end of this decade. I guarantee you. Because
Yeah.
we had corollaries for this in the 60s and 70s. You know what I mean? And that those are all just like sort of curios now. I mean, we had like sort of like socially conscious superheroes and stuff that were as popular as the woke superheroes are now, which is to say not popular at all. And now we sort of look at them as kind of like a little time capsule. They're like little artifacts from this lost world. And I believe that we will look at all these kind of these woke things that you talk about. But yes, there is. I mean, I definitely believe there is an agenda to break these old
Yeah.
structures down. But like I said, I think that it's all just going to end in catastrophe. I
Oh,
really do.
it's like a Babel story. It's an all-out assault on the holy, right? And if you consider the archetypal and the imaginal holy, and I do, that's what I think we're witnessing. And of course, it's going to fail because it fails every time. It fails every time we do this. We just have to live through the destruction that it wreaks. But that's why I find this kind of like this exploration of the movements of, I hate using the word fiction because I don't think that's right, but the exploration of the movement of these shapes and personalities through the imaginal over a 150-year period is kind of like realizing, oh, there are other people here all along, right? Like I'm not saying like Batman is a, well, our gods wear spandex, right? Batman is something, and you can there's a couple of ways you can talk about it as like a gloss on an earlier archetype. It doesn't necessarily matter. It's a thing that emerged in the imaginal and kind of shaped the world, and that's super interesting. Bringing it back to pulps as we close out, from where the shapes for superheroes actually came from, is this kind of uh, imperial moment of angel magic, for want of a better term.
That's
Yeah,
a good term.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, because Batman is just flat out the shadow.
yeah,
Um, it's just they kind of admitted, a lot of the early Batman stories, the ones where it doesn't show Bruce Wayne and an 8-year-old boy in bed, were basically just rewrites of old Shadow stories.
yeah. Was the
But
shadow a pedo as well, or was that just that's
no,
just
I
Bruce?
don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think so. He didn't have a boy side. Like the whole thing with all these boy sidekicks is just, I don't
It's
know.
not. It's not appropriate. It's like, on the one hand, you can kind of squint at it and go, well, we're trying to sell this stuff to boys, so maybe we can make them feel involved. That doesn't mean get in the bed with Bruce Wayne like it's fucking Michael Jackson, you know?
No, I'm sure you've seen those panels online and stuff. But I mean, again, going back to Jerry Siegel, interestingly enough, Superman's direct precedents were two different characters, both called Doctor Occult. Right. So one was the classic sort of late Victorian occult detective, right, that we saw all over the place. And arguably you can fold in characters like the Shadow and the Spider and Green Llama and all these pulp heroes. And then he became like the caped figure. And if you look, but he's still called Doctor Occult, right? But he's basically Superman, but just the costume is a bit different. But he has the cape and he flies around and all this kind of stuff. So that's the foundational modern superhero, the spandex god superhero. But boy, Jerry Siegel, man, later on in life, he created this character called Mr. Muscles, and it's just flat out pedo porn. Like he finds this young, sensitive boy, this young rich boy, and he's being picked on. And he's like, "Well, to come to the gym," and also, it's just the whole thing is just wank. It's just porn. You know what I'm saying? Without the actual fucking
Yeah,
right. But this goes to show you that the people who sort of midwife these ideas into the culture more often than not were not healthy people. Wonder Woman. I mean, Wonder Woman is the most explicitly mythic of all the major
yeah,
superheroes, right? I mean, it's just pure rewrites of mythology. I mean, it's garbled and stupid, but she's created by Aphrodite and so on like that. That guy was, they made a movie about how he was in this like sort of threesome, and everybody knew that he was sort of into bondage and stuff. But I went back and looked at those comics, and it's like, okay, so it's like bondage and pedophilia. I mean, real pedophilia too. I'm not talking about like not Jerry, Jeffrey Epstein screwing like 16-year-old trailer trash girls. I'm talking about like babies, like fucked up shit. Like that's what real pedophilia is. It's not like wanting to bang 16-year-olds. It's about wanting to bang babies, and it's like this progression into hell. And that stuff is in his comics too. So it's just like, these archetypes were never wholesome to begin with.
No.
They were not created by people with wholesome or positive or spiritual impulses. They were, this classic nerds. I mean, you can't separate nerds and pedophilia
Funny you
culturally.
mention that, right? Like first time I went to the jungle, I thought ayahuasca, didn't think to ask her, was one of the watchers, because I could see how a watcher cult would form, say 10, 12,000 years ago, around this being that showed up and healed people, and like you'd all have the same experience, and we'd all lie around in the river the next day talking about it, and different parts of our experience matched everyone else's. So this entity had come down and we'd had this amazing and transformative thing. So last time, so in June, I asked her, are you one of the watchers? And she laughed and she said, no, but I know those guys. They came in from elsewhere. They fell in from elsewhere. And I'm like, cool, because she's very much more a spirit of the earth thing. And I'm like, it's more that I could see how a cult, if you look at ayahuasca cults in a Shipibo or native context, and they're not really ayahuasca cults, but I can look at them and go back 12,000 years in my head, like, or 8,000, and go, this is the shape of this, of like, it feels like a cult, right? And coming to what you were just saying there about these people not being right in the head that midwife these things into culture, beings like the Watchers have conditions. So if you look at the stuff that they gave us, metallurgy, makeup, all this kind of stuff, very useful, but they do have conditions. Right?
They always do.
Yeah, there's a transactional arrangement, right? It's not that fun. It's not the generosity of something like ayahuasca, where if you actually do show up, she heals because that's what she does, right? Like the Watchers are a specific. Yeah, they have conditions. They are a certain kind of being that can be useful. And do you think that's it? Like, do you think someone's head needs to be? Here's a question: chicken or the egg, pedo or the egg? Do you think they were fucked up to begin with, and that's how they were able to midwife them, or do you think midwifing them fucked them up?
What, the creators of these characters?
Yeah.
No, I it's just that kind of, I don't even know what you call it, but it's just classic nerd stuff. Nerds often experience sexual trauma, but they also experience sexual rejection pretty much their entire adolescences, and I think that shapes them, and I think it kind of freezes them. When all the girls in school think you're disgusting, right, or the boys, right, for that matter, it kind of freezes you in that you're trapped in that world, right? You can't get out of it, and that's why I think but it also might something to do with brain chemistry and so on. But the thing I wanted to get back to, because I wanted to just touch back on Brill for a second, but like, so Brill, in my estimation, is kind of like a cautionary satire of technocracy, right? Because the Brill themselves are much more technologically advanced than the surface dwellers and all this kind of thing. I think there's an argument to be made, a serious argument to be made, that First Enoch and the Watchers are not unlike that, because an Israeli archaeologist, talked about how, he talked about the origin of Enoch and a lot of these kind of like folk myths and so on, but also books like Book of the Watchers and so on. What is it? Testimony of Abraham and so on. He basically said that the Watchers are, these Assyrian sort of the Shadu, you know what I'm saying? Like the bullmen, the winged bullmen and so on. And that there's an argument to be made that it could be, diaspora Jews commenting on the Assyrians, right? Because the Assyrians were very technologically, particularly when it came to like engines, war engines, and so on. And they were, pretty impressive in the context of you know the Middle East and so on. So there's an argument to be made that this is not necessarily a description of objective reality entities, but using these archetypes to either satirize or critique this really brutal empire, the Assyrian Empire or the Neo-Babylonian. I mean, there was all these sort of stages to this. If you're familiar with the history of Mesopotamia, it's like
Sure.
musical chairs, right? But there is that argument to be made. But I think that one thing that I always, when I read Enoch and I read the story of the Watchers, it reminds me of Augustine quoting earlier testimony, pagan testimony about the demons of the air. Right? Who is it? Is it Apuleius? I think it's Apuleius. Giving testimony because he was accused of sorcery and so on, and he's giving testimony in court actually about like how the demons of the air will give gifts to magicians, right? Which is technology, isn't it?
Yeah.
But also require just constant attention. They require these rituals and sacrifices and observations, and you constantly have to like tell them how great they are and stuff. And they get very wounded if you don't do these things. That kind of reminded me a lot of, even though it's there's an elemental difference, obviously, in demons of the air and the watchers on the ground. But I think it kind of boils down to the same thing. I think the in my estimation, in my personal opinion, the objective reality behind the watchers or the demons of the air or whomever is just much different and much weirder and almost unknowable to us today. Like I don't think,
Sure.
or anybody or anytime, like we create these stories, we create these myths to kind of try to create an interface from, the mythic or the imaginal or the sacred, I mean, or all of the above, and kind of translate it into more static, more material terms that people are going to understand, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that those stories are exactly true. You
Sure.
understand what I'm saying? I mean,
Mm.
it's an attempt to capture a reality that we really can't wrap our heads around, and I feel that more and more all the time. Particularly with my mystical practices and stuff. It's just like you just start to realize that we can't know, or we're not allowed to know. Whatever the case may be, it's like we can create these stories, but we try and take it into our context, right? We try
Yeah.
and sort of colonize the sacred and the unknowable and put it into terms that we understand, right? And then people get hung up on all the terminology and so on. But I think that the reality behind this is just far greater than we can understand. I really
Definitely.
do. And you learned all about this with your the ayahuasca and so on. So you know I think this is another reason why these kind of glorious revolutions are always destined to fail. The great
Absolutely.
great reset.
It's the same sin every time, right? It is that it's the sin of Babel. That's what it is. The
Mm,
ayahuasca thing was fascinating. By the end of the month, of getting these amazing lessons on dimensionality and how dimensions work and so on. I'm like, this is
mm,
incredible. Then I sort of next morning, I try to think about them or write them down,
yeah.
and they just don't work down here. And that's what it is. The whole point of the lesson about dimensions is you're in a dimension that can't understand dimensionality. Deal with it, right?
Well, see, but here's the thing that concerns me, right? Because we're in the midst of what I call MK Ultra 3.0. And you go on Facebook, and at least I am, whatever algorithm they've keyed in on me, and I'm constantly getting these ads for ketamine therapy and so on, which I'm just not down with. I mean, I'm not anti hallucinogen or entheogen at all, right? At all. But like, why? It's always sort of like, why are you being so nice to me? Why are you offering me this ketamine? And then finding out that they're using ketamine now as an anesthetic in emergency rooms, and it's just like, okay, all right, let's just hold on a second here. And then with people like Rogan and everybody pushing the DMT stuff, right? Um, I just I find that incredibly irresponsible. I mean, because about the whole like the horror stories of the ayahuasca trail, with all these idiots coming down and not knowing, having no preparation, and just they're there for because they read about ayahuasca in BuzzFeed or something, right? It's just it's like juggling chainsaws. It's like I'm not against these things at all. But what I'm against is people just doing these things completely irresponsibly, and like, why are all these NGOs and foundations and think tanks and corporations and governmental bodies so excited about psychedelic research, quote unquote? So when it's like, why all of a sudden that, and why all of a sudden like the UFO stuff, right?
Yeah, sure.
And it just starts to, because you can't separate the two, obviously, right? It just
Yeah.
starts to feel like, this is part of what I'm talking about. This is part of breaking down the old structures, and then basically, setting people up for entity possession, which
Consciously or unconsciously, right? Like, I'm suspicious of the weaponization of psilocybin.
Mhm.
I'm kind of cynical about microdosing. I have friends who do it, but I only do, which has happened once a year, um, actual mushrooms, and I do them in an actual ceremony, rather than like
gummies.
keeping that door open forever. Don't know, but it's that same sin. Like, they think that they can capture and technocratize the sacred, and so that then you have a synthetic variant of what was a sacred and previously holy communion done correctly. Now you can get now Google text can get microdosed psilocybin, and there's no need for mushrooms. There's no need to be outside. There's no need to be under the stars taking it. It's none of that. It's that further and further enclosing into that synthetic universe.
Well, full disclosure, I microdose, so
There you go.
so, but
It's so cynical.
but you know, I think the weaponization is just a term I keep coming back to. There's nothing wrong with an airplane unless you use it to drop bombs on people. There's nothing wrong with a kitchen knife unless you use it to stab someone. I mean, there are all these kind of false dichotomies set up that start to obscure these distinctions, right? But I still think they hold true. So I mean, I don't. There's nothing objectively wrong with entheogens or ayahuasca or any of these compounds used responsibly and used with caution, right? There is something wrong about just getting a bunch of bored, not educated, not socialized college kids into you know, into a workshop and then just pumping them full of ketamine,
Yeah,
which is what they're doing. I mean, it's literally what they're doing.
yeah,
That's not going to end well. You know what I mean? And that's why I was saying with the DMT, it's like DMT is not a toy. DMT isn't like smoking a joint or it's or microdosing. DMT is that's like juggling chainsaws. That's the juggling chainsaws of the hallucinogenic world.
yeah.
And I mean, I just really feel like there is an overall program. I mean, I really believe. We've probably talked about this, but I've talked about this on other formats and platforms. Like, I really believe that the real purpose of MK Ultra at all was to prepare people for entity possession.
Mm.
And it just came from actually reading the case studies and reading the reports and stuff. And I'm going, yeah, this isn't science. This is basically a technocratic shamanic initiation. You know, um, to the extreme. I mean, you basically erasing people's personalities and replacing it with something else, which they said over and over again, by the way. And that's, where does this something else come from? I mean, it's like, I honestly believe that it is about entity possession. And all you have to do is just go on Twitter or TikTok or whomever and just see what's going on out there. I mean, I've been saying this. This is what really, I used to really, oh God, demonic possession and everything. I just, oh, get that away from me because of all the dumb, hysterical snake handle bullshit attached to it. But I just see it more and more now. I just see people who are
Totally.
just no longer in control of themselves, and people acting like Regan in The Exorcist. I mean, just like the same, and it doesn't seem performative. It doesn't seem stagey. It just seems like they're just gone. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? And maybe some believe that they really are NPCs. That they're really just placeholders. They're not fully sentient or conscious human beings, and they never were. I mean, maybe that's the case. I don't know, but I just see all these trends as being unsettling. And then when you throw in, like I said before, the UFO stuff, and coupled with at least 40 years, 45 years now, going back to Close Encounters, which is just basically alien propaganda, right? And it's a wonderful film and it's well made and everything like that, but it's just basically conditioning people that that these waif-like space saviors. I don't know if that's something I feel entirely comfortable with, just because that's kind of how the what was it? It was in Hispaniola. I mean, it's kind of how the native tribes saw the Spaniards when they first showed up, and
True.
that's not a very
Yeah.
comforting precedent, is it?
Nice one. Well, anything else about pulps? We bring it to a close.
Well, like I said, I really do want to do a book on the pulps, um,
Mm.
and the pulp heroes and all this kind of stuff. I find it to be so much more interesting than the actual superheroes.
And what
Um,
should people read from the pulps? With you having read them, what do you think? Like,
I don't try reading the actual pulps. I mean, it's a very dated. No, it really is. It's a very dated kind of storytelling, and it's not hard. I mean, it's not easy to pour through. Um, you know, just wait for my book on the pulps,
there you
where
go.
I'll
All right.
I'll, I'll just walk you through it. But
Yeah,
uh,
nice one. And I watched The Shadow when you recommended it. I was going to watch it on the plane to New Zealand, but I ended up watching it one night in New Zealand. I didn't remember it fondly either. And I think it's because I might have confused it with something else that wasn't that bad, but it's neither here nor there. Was the Dick Tracy with Madonna in it that came out around the
mm,
same time? And
mhm.
so in my head, I kind of went,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I think a
yeah,
lot of people did. Yeah,
yeah,
I think that was a very common mistake. Everybody trying to sort of cap capture that 1989 Batman lightning in a bottle. Um, but no, I mean, I really like it. I mean, I
mm,
was a Shadow fan when I was a kid. I used to listen to. I had these like LPs of the old radio shows and stuff. And plus I love the comic books. They started doing comic books again when I was a kid. So I was already there for it. And it is very campy. It's very it's almost sort of like Provincetown Playhouse version of the
yeah.
Shadow. You
I
know what I
get that.
mean? Like
But
it's very
it
camp.
suits it in its own way. Like that
It
was kind of
does,
cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because it's kind of like the only way that you can do that stuff now. You can't do like 30s or 40s straight stories straight. You have to do something like Dark City, or just play it as a goof, because it's too far removed from our reality. The way people talk, the way they dress,
Yeah.
the cars they drive. I mean, everything about it is just like it might as well be another universe. So you do have to kind of give people that little bit of distance. But I think, I don't know, it should be better known than it is. And I think that um, your minions and so on will enjoy it. And anybody who's a Batman Begins fan will probably get a kick of just like
That's the thing. If you
how
want the
it's
gritty reboot of the Shadow, just watch Batman Begins.
which all it's just it's stunning to me. It's like beat for beat in so many different ways. But that's Batman to begin with.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when you talk about the archetypes too, because Denny O'Neil had pointed out actually on an Our Gods Wear Spandex New York Convention panel that the devil in like late medieval, you know, on up till like the 16th, 17th century was depicted as a Batman. Right? It was
Mm.
depicted as this kind of like dark figure, usually with horns or big ears and bat wings. And I was like, oh, there you go. I wish I had thought about that before I wrote the damn book, but there you go. But
Yeah, it works. Like as Lord of the Earth and Lord of Night, like he actually has his own. The medieval conception of the devil has his own morality if you interact with him. Like you can appeal to the devil for justice in unjust situations. So again, it's
mm,
one of those things that you look at it and go, this stuff. Was Jung's point, right? That you can't. We ignore this stuff at our peril, and more importantly, it's not even that we ignore it. We have untrained our capacity to understand and interact with the imaginal to our tremendous detriment, and that's going to destroy civilization, which is literally what's happening. That's kind of what he's saying. Like we've desensitized ourselves to it by thinking we're rational, and that stuff is superstitious, and it's going to blow up like a volcano and kill everyone. And I think he's probably right.
well, that's a rather grim thought. I mean, hopefully, cooler heads will prevail, but I don't know. I think
Yeah,
that just this whole idea of apotheosis is so much a driving force with the
yeah,
technocracy, obviously, but also the terror of mortality. I mean, just look at sort of the one of the founding fathers of the modern technocratic mindset, Ray Kurzweil, with the whole
yeah.
transhumanism and singularity. It's just complete and total nonsense. And it's nonsense that I believed up until a couple of years ago, and maybe a lot of people still believe. But it's all based in the terror of death, which I think at its core is anti-nature. You know,
Absolutely. That's
you
a
know.
very good way of saying it. Martin Armstrong thought that in 2020 when the Great Reset began, because like Klaus and Pelosi and all these people are all in their 80s. And he's like, are they just afraid of are they trying to get this, which is obvious bullshit, fourth industrial revolution up and running because they're worried they're going to die before they get their like little immortality robots like jammed into them or whatever bullshit they think's going to keep them alive. And it's
Well, I
plainly
don't.
there. If it's
I mean,
not there consciously, it's there unconsciously. They're these horrible people's fear of death.
well, exactly right. And I start to wonder um, because that was 2020, right? And
Yeah,
there would this whole idea that we'll take advantage of this totally natural, totally spontaneous crisis, right?
yeah,
To build back better. And everybody was talking about build back better and all this kind of stuff. I think that kind of curdled. And I think like Jeffrey Epstein's death, it took a while to sort of cycle through because Epstein was bankrolling, transhumanism and singularity nonsense and just all this kind of technocratic fantasy. I mean, I might be totally wrong, but one thing I keep saying is that I really get the sense that they believe this shit. Like, and it's not supposition on my part because if you
yeah,
watch Klaus Schwab at these Davos things and he's just talking like sheer absolute technocratic fantasy, and then his
yeah.
little catamite there, that who's that little fraud? Harari, what is it?
Yuval
Yuval
Noah, Yuval Nova
Yuval
Harari.
Noah Harari,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Who
yeah,
and he just talks, and every time one of his nonsensical proclamations goes viral, I always just make a point. It's like this guy is not a scientist, he's not an engineer, he has no technical training. He's has a degree as a historian.
yeah,
He has as much right to talk about this stuff as anybody else. But I really think that like they believed it's kind of like all the kings who believed that the alchemists would turn lead into gold.
Yeah.
You know, just kept tossing money at them, and then finally they just kind of realized, like, wait a minute, where's my gold, right? This is, you've been just like leading me on, haven't you? And I think that's the way it's going with, you know, Build Back
Yeah.
Better and the Great Reset and everything. And I kind of wonder if, like, maybe this whole World War III agenda isn't necessarily part of some overarching plan, but just kind of like a nihilistic response, you know, amongst the gerontocracy, that, you know, their robot bodies are not coming. You know, they're not going to be able to upload their consciousness into a Cray supercomputer in the deserts of Utah. They're going
Mm.
to die like everybody else. And it almost just seems like this nihilistic tantrum in many
Yeah.
ways.
Well, that's got to at least be there on the unconscious level, right? Like,
Mhm.
so because it's plainly the case. The viciousness and just the malice and that pure neocon malice of, it's almost like Catherine Fitz said this on the weekend on her Money and Markets. The attitude to Eurasia, which we got from the British in like the late 1700s, was, if I can't have you, no one will. Like, it's literally that level of like um malice, but like and that's just at the surface.
Possession
Yeah,
too.
exactly. And that's and it's certainly for people who have probably worked out, nope, you're going to die and probably go to hell, because that's also real. let's
And you
let's
deserve
make
it.
this work. Exactly. Go on. Well, all right, sir, this has been super fun. What you got coming up, other than obviously hopefully rapidly going away to write a book about the pulps? But other than that, what's happening, what's going on, where can people find you, and the unlikely chance they don't know how to?
Well, just go to secretsun.blogspot.com, or just do a search on Secret Sun blog, whatever. I'm easy to find. Yeah, lots going on. I tried doing I had a series of live streams planned for my Patreon members, and last night YouTube told me that I've reached my quota. I was like, what does that mean? I reached my quota? What quota? Nobody told me anything about the quota. And they go, click this link. And I click this link, and it just like, it says, like, I did a search. The page says nothing about quotas. I don't know what's going on. I think it's probably just, it might be just more Google election interference. You know what I'm saying? Clamping down on all the independent thinkers or whatever. I'm not
I,
exactly
I
sure, but
think there is technically a live streaming limit, but it's quite high. So you must have been really churning them out, because that otherwise you can just leave it on forever as like your security cam or whatever, and clog up the pipes. But
I mean, I see people who do 4-hour live streams every day, so I'm
yeah,
not
true.
exactly sure. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe maybe
No.
it was a glitch. I don't know. I'm gonna look into it
You
and
can
find
live
my
stream on Rumble too. So if it happens again, just
that. Yeah, that's my
yeah,
next choice. You know, the only reason I've been a little resistant to that is that, you know, so many people, you know, when they want to join the live chats, which are very lively and a lot of fun, you know, I don't want them to have to register on yet another platform,
yeah.
but you know, I might end up having to do that. But you have to pay, as a creator,
Yeah,
you have to pay.
I pay a nominal amount. I've only used it once for a live stream, but I pay like a nominal amount. But you do have to pay for it. It's like $5 or $6, which I resent. But by the same token, this is Google, so I'm paying for it one way or the other, right? Yeah.
Well, you know, just getting back to my, um, uh, I don't what I call it, pessimism or skepticism about the future of the technocracy. I point you no further than the delicious collapse of Meta.
Yeah,
Um,
true.
just
Yeah.
watching, um, you know, their new Coke, the metaverse, which is just never going to happen, or at least not never going to happen anywhere near the scale that they predicted. Um, they've lost 59% of their market cap. Now they're talking about laying off 12,000 people, hiring freeze. Yes, the gods of the technocrats are extremely fickle and capricious gods, and
Uh,
enjoy nothing better than to shiv their favorite acolytes. So, but also, I mean, just the whole idea of just basic complexity. I think that the technocratic agenda is the classic, trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah.
It just totally dispenses with the reality of systemic complexity. And it's like, well, everybody can just do this. Everybody just can use this currency, and blah 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 blah. It's not going to work. And I think they kind of know it too, which is dangerous, by the way.
That's where we're at. This is the Hail Mary, and it's still not going to work, but it's going to be messy.
Yeah. Right. Well, nobody said that. Nobody guaranteed you, and if nothing else, it's not going to be boring. So
that's also true. All right. Well, and thanks everyone in the chat, and thank you, Mr. Knowles. Always a pleasure, always scintillating, and yeah, catch you all in the next one.